You're listening to The Big Lift, the podcast of Web Trends Optimize, the CRO solution that enables marketers and developers to maximize the ROI on their digital properties. Web Trends Optimize is a powerful, feature-rich and easy-to-use solution, all delivered within a fixed-price contract with no additional cost for increased functionality ever. During these podcasts, we meet some of the key influencers within the marketing and conversion world to understand their roles and examine their challenges. In this episode, I make no apologies for the promotion of a regular monthly event, which I believe can only be beneficial to those that are interested in meeting up with like-minded people around the topics of experimentation and CRO. I'm in discussion with Mark Palfreeman, Senior Business Intelligence Manager at Flutter, whose companies include Skybet, Paddy Power and Betfair, and is also the co-founder of Experimentation North. We discuss why he believes that physical events are at the core of increasing education around experimentation, developing best practice and building strong networks. Mark, what interested you in experimentation after graduating with a history degree?
I mean, that's a great question. I make plenty of bones to tell people I'm a qualified historian and Egyptologist, which doesn't lend itself either to the gambling industry or maths, really. But I've worked in a variety of industries. I'm quite digitally minded, decent grasp of statistics and numbers, and marketing and data, and all that sort of comes together to be in that sort of e-commerce space where you're dealing with numbers, you're dealing with marketing type things. And I guess through that I've got into e-commerce, and through e-commerce kind of product management and analytics with my data head. And naturally, as a product analyst, then one of the things that you focus on is experimentation, because when product managers are doing experimentation, it's invariably the analysts who are supporting them on that. And really that's where I landed, I guess, in the past couple of years. And it's something that we're doing a lot more of here in Flutter, and we're primarily part of that.
So it would seem a strange move from being a historian and Egyptologist into analytics and data. It's almost like two different sides of the brain. Do you find that anything that you learned being a historian has got any value in what you're doing today?
I think history is broad enough that it teaches you something about everything. And that was always the logic about going into it. So when I was actually at university, the plan was to be a journalist, a sports journalist, ideally. And again, history was very broad. So it taught you basics of English, it taught you reasoning and stuff like that. And if you think about experimentation, using logic and reasoning to try and understand the data and customer behaviours, they do sort of go hand in hand in some ways. Now, you're completely right, it's at odds when it comes to the statistics side of it. But the idea of using history to learn from and using experimentation to learn from, we're always learning from the past. And that actually mirrors quite nicely that it's this constant idea of learning from the past, learning from past experiments, etc.
So you're Senior Business Intelligence Manager at Flutter, and you're also co-founder of Experimentation North?
Indeed.
So can you tell me a little bit about what Experimentation North is, and why did you set it up in the first place?
So it essentially came out of the frustration that, as I said, we've moved in Flutter towards an experimentation culture here. We're driving forward in that world, and we're at the forefront in product analytics. And as part of that role, I wanted to engage more with the community and the people that were out there, share experiences, get a view of how other companies were tackling some of the things we were. And invariably, it meant going down to London. I mean, this feels like Scandinavia, Holland and London are three quite big hubs around experimentation in Europe. And it was quite frustrating that every time you want to go to even a meetup, then there are meetups in London. There's a lot of people in London. It probably lends itself very nicely. But it was frustrating that for me, I had to pay 150, 200 quid to get down on the train, probably have an overnight stay somewhere in London. So even for a meetup, you're talking a few hundred quid. And that was frustrating. Whereas in the north, we've got some huge companies up here, the likes of Asda, BBC, Flutter, just massive companies who are doing this sort of stuff. And rather than just being frustrated, I thought, well, why don't I start my own thing, which is this Experimentation North idea. And the plan is that it is a free monthly meetup where we can get people together who work in this field, and they can share best practice, they can talk about things they're working on, ask questions of each other, they can grow that network and really help each other. As I think it's a relatively new practice. I mean, experimentation itself isn't, but this idea of digital experimentation is not too old, and I think the community is there to be grown and sort of to help each other through that. And that's why we set it up. So it alternates between Manchester and Leeds every second Wednesday of the month. And so far we've had a great take-up of attendees and stuff, so hopefully it'll just grow from strength to strength.
So you mentioned it was a physical event. Are people happy to go back up? You know, the COVID had a dramatic effect on all these type of things. Are people happy to come back together now and socialise and do the things that you want them to do?
I think it's sort of become something of a novelty. I mean, I'm old enough, I've worked long enough that I remember coming into work every single day of the week, and that doesn't happen, certainly for Flutter anymore. We here in Leeds have very busy midweeks, very quiet start and end to the week. And I think the novelty of being able to meet people in person is something that people embrace probably a little bit more than you would pre-COVID, because you were doing that anyway. So now you can create those connections and do that little bit of networking, and maybe it doesn't take as much out of the social battery as it did when you were doing a full day of work and then going to something like this. So I don't know if we're playing into that novelty idea, and I think there is huge benefit from meeting people in person. I mean, I'm talking over a podcast right now, so we're not in person, but I think you do get a lot more just one-to-one time and understanding people's facial expressions and getting closer to them and being able to talk possibly more candidly. I think Zoom calls and stuff like that is an appointment to do work kind of thing, and doing something where it's just social and it's in person is a little bit different now.
It being a physical event obviously has costs associated with it, and you say the events that you set up are free to those people that want to attend. So how is it funded?
It's funded by the generosity of many people in the community, if I'm honest. We've been exceptionally lucky that Flutter, so my employer, have given us sponsorship of all the Leeds events, and they've got a great venue here in Leeds where we can host the events as well, and that takes a huge headache off our minds as organisers. And it's a real testament not only to how Flutter are committed to experimentation, but also committed to its colleagues as well, and really willing to support our development and sort of, I was going to say, growing their standing in Leeds. I think they're fairly established in Leeds, but creating that network that they're part of can only be beneficial for them. And aside from Flutter, there's plenty of people within the community, whether it's agency side, whether it's speakers, whether it's suppliers, who understand that this is quite a close-knit community, and growing it really benefits everybody. And the more we can talk about it, the bigger the community can get, the more we all benefit, the more we all learn. And therefore we've got some great sponsors who have supported us, and the costs go to things like venue, food, drinks, to make the experience as good as it can be for our attendees.
So give me an outline of what an evening would be like. Is it just one presenter, or is it a topic with multiple presenters? How does it work?
So the plan is that we're going to vary it over the year. We've already got dates in for all of 2025, and I think there's a chance it gets stale mid-year if we don't vary it. So the first event that we had, which was fantastically attended, we had two speakers, and they both spoke for about 20 minutes each. We did a little bit of pizza and chat over drinks beforehand, and then two speakers. We had John Crowder from Journey Further up in Leeds, and also Natasha Senior, who was at Sky in the experimentation team. And then after that there was questions for each of the speakers, and then we did a little bit more networking afterwards. I'm open to the idea of varying it, so having a single topic or a single theme for one of the events, or doing a sort of Q&A, kind of moderated Q&A style, because I think we need to keep it fresh. And things like the crap talks that were successful up north managed to keep it fresh and keep changing things up, and that's the key thing really.
Do you see it as a kind of an education vehicle or a kind of social vehicle, or a bit of both?
I think it can be both. It depends what angle you're coming from. I think it's a really funny topic in terms of that there are no or very few categorical right and wrongs. It's largely opinion and experience. And I think that's why it's so useful to be able to share with other people who are doing this, because understanding how they're doing it, how other businesses are doing it, and what pitfalls they they came across when they did it can help you in your business. So I think the learnings bit is really important. I think people who are new to it can learn from some people who have been doing it for a little while. So like I say, somebody like Tash, who's been doing it in Sky, is great in terms of growing the culture and how she broke down the barriers within that company of getting the experimentation culture out there. And I think it's great as a learning experience, but also, like I say, it's a proper community. There's some genuinely really lovely people. In fact, I'm yet to meet somebody I don't like in this community. And therefore, the more of these I go to, the more I find myself happily seeing people I know across the room and just enjoying having a chat with them.
And when you're there, are the people there just CRO or testing specialists that's in there?
It tends to be people who are working around experimentation and CRO, but I think there's something in there for everybody, because experimentation should be done across all the teams. That's me preaching a little bit from a company that's not quite there yet, but I think how important tech teams are to experimentation was something that came out of the talk last Wednesday, and therefore any tech teams that are involved in experimentation or developing for experimentation would get something out of it. I think as part of the CRO stuff, you've got discovery, which means you're talking about research and you're talking about designers. You've got BI analysts who might be analysing some of the experiments that we're doing. So it really is for anybody who touches this world, and I think it will only grow. So I think more teams will find themselves thinking, I need to understand this experimentation and this way of working. So it really is open for everybody.
So you say it's open, but how do you get attendees? I know in the CRO world it's probably quite reasonably easy, but outside of that, when you talk about product teams or BI specialists or things like that, it must be quite difficult to be able to get them to give up a few hours in their evening to be able to come and do something. So what's your ploy?
Free pizza is the main is the main ploy, which seems to work for most events that tech certainly go to. But we've added free drinks as well for anybody that might cover. So, I've aimed largely at the product management world because they tend to be the owners. It's certainly in the world we are the owners of the experiments. But I think when you start looking at marketing and different parts of websites, then you're probably going to find people who are involved in this indirectly. And hopefully, once you hook a couple of people in the company, whether that's not the right person, they might acknowledge that actually our company is doing some of this. So they forward it on to those people. And I'm hoping the more we can spread the word, the more we can get to the right people. And again, the community we've got out there is great, that they're connected to a lot of people who are doing this in big business, whether they've worked with them, they've spoken to them, they've met them at one of these kind of events, and therefore we're using that to leverage getting out to attendees as well. Somebody spoke to me the other day about a data science specific one that was quite statistical, and I love the idea of that, but as you say, we're going to have to try and make sure we pitch that at a totally different audience.
Yeah, that was the kind of my next question is, are you thinking of segregating it out? Because there are different drivers to those different types of teams, such as you say, the analysts, the marketers might be able to see things slightly differently. They don't necessarily want to go deep into the weeds. They want to be able to know what's the kind of experiments we should be looking at and those sorts of things. So do you think you've got the capability to be able to expand what you're doing into those more direct focus events?
I do, by using the advocates we've got, basically. So in theory, something like this attracts the people who are the biggest advocates of this way of working through connections, through job titles, etc. So if we can get those biggest advocates, and then we do look to sort of do an event round a theme, hopefully those advocates might recognise that, and within their business they may steer the data scientists towards this sort of stuff, because that works for everybody, because within that company, they're probably the people who are trying to get data science to be more interested in experimentation. And then the data scientists are trying to learn more so they can get more involved with it. So I think it sort of works for everything, but it's through those main advocates that hopefully we can generate over the next 3 months.
So we mentioned marketers there. There's a lot of what I would describe as ignorance is too strong a word, but I think there is a lot of people who I've heard of CRO, I've heard of testing, but feel that it's probably outside of their remit because they're essentially a brand or a product marketer as opposed to a business analyst or a product analyst. How do you get people who are of that kind of persuasion to come to an event where a lot of the jargon is used, and I say that as sympathetically as I can, which would potentially put those people off?
I think they have to have a growth mindset and understand that whether they're put off by it or not, this is coming. And therefore, if they can get ahead of it, then actually that'll place them quite well in the companies that they're in, because they'll have started looking into this before it sort of gets pushed on them, I guess. The other thing is, there's a lot of human behaviours that can potentially stop experimentation from being successful. Things like politics getting in the way, speed to things happening, the idea that maybe we can fail. And I think that's a mindset that companies are quickly going to have to get out of, move to the idea that it's all about learning.
But isn't that much more of a top-down approach? It's difficult for somebody in the bottom to push their way up and say, actually, we need to adopt a feeling of test everything and we could be wrong. It's a big pill to swallow for somebody higher up the tree to have a junior that says, oh, well, actually, perhaps we ought to look at that. That's a challenge, I think.
That's a massive challenge, and ironically, I did a backup deck for last Wednesday because somebody said to me, "What if one of the speakers is ill?" And my backup deck was all about fostering this culture of learning, basically, because I think as a leader, it's quite easy to reject a culture of experimentation for all the reasons that I've just mentioned. The longer it takes to build things, the chance, like the win rate of 12%, so 1 in 10 experiments will fail. But it's much more difficult to reject a culture of learning. So if you may have a success rate of 12%, but you've got a learning rate of 100%, because whether it succeeds or fails, you're going to learn in every experiment. And I think that's how you get leadership on board, because it's going to be really rare to find a leader who says they don't want to learn about their customers. So I think you're completely right. It needs to be top down. But I think changing this mindset is how you get those leaders on board. And I think there's some great people in this community who have managed to do this and different ways of doing it. So Tash last week talked about how finance cared about the numbers that her team was giving them, and that became law within their business, and that's how they managed to get experimentation as the business numbers that mattered. And there'll be other examples of people that have done it in different ways, and there'll be agencies who have gone into companies and challenged this specific kind of challenge and come out the other side successful. And that's where Experimentation North is great, because not every technique will work for every business, but if you can have a community of people and you can get 4 or 5 different approaches and then take that back to your company and you can use that with your leadership, that's how you can get leadership thinking, experimentation might be the way that we should do this, and get that top-down culture.
One of the things that I've talked about on previous podcasts is the fact that education of testing isn't necessarily a complete part of the marketing package that marketers go through. And so therefore they hear about it, they kind of think, that's somebody else's job potentially. And that must be quite difficult. So from what you're doing, I could see that your events could actually be held at a University of Marketing or the marketing course in universities, because I think that broadening of well, it's not me, it's somebody else, has to be broken down significantly for this to grow to the levels that it's doing in Sky and Flutter, for instance, because there is resistance, and if the person that's trying to push it has little knowledge, that becomes much more challenging. And if they know more and it becomes part of the curriculum that they come out with their marketing degree, hopefully it'll grow again. So perhaps it might be something that you look at and say, okay, well, let's go to the local universities and throw in an evening course or something like that. And if you give them free pizzas, there'll be lots of people there.
100%. I think experimentation can be exceptionally scary. I mean, when you start talking about p-values and randomization and winterization, like I'm an analyst talking to you about this stuff, and there'll be marketeers listening to this saying, well, we don't understand any of that. And I go back to the fact that I'm a historian and an Egyptologist. I'm not a statistician. And I think there are some great resources out there where it boils down experimentation into what you need to know. You don't have to know the ins and outs of a p-value and winsorization, but it's the mindset of test and learn that I think people can adopt. And you can dip into, like with a community like this, you can dip into any of the areas you want to know about a little bit more with the right people. And we'll have events that, if you're really interested in the statistics side, we'll have an event where you can come along and hear more about statistics, but you don't have to have that overbearing idea of, I know everything about this to get going. I think it's great, the idea of having a university course or something like that. And I know there are some things that we can get out there, but if this can evolve into something like that, I'll be very happy.
One of the things I think that when you look at this kind of process of marketers in particular, because I think that's where there's a big void in all of this, where the adoption of testing potentially challenges what I would describe as the gut feel that marketers believe they have. And that's a big hurdle when you're in a company in a junior role and you're saying, oh, actually, I've got this feeling. So I think there's this enormous opportunity to get into the fact that you can think, well, this is a gut feeling, but if I can prove that gut feeling works, then it's going to be much more beneficial. But I still don't think there's enough people talking about gut feeling is not a bad thing as long as you test that gut feeling. And there seems to be a lot of people that are saying, well, actually, you can't just leave it down to gut. You've got to be able to do the research and the analysis. And I think there's probably the truth is there in between both of those. But I think trying to be able to get those marketers on board is key for the success of testing, experimentation, or whatever it wants. And I think the way that marketers are financed from a funding perspective, the fact that, if they get so much revenue from Google AdWords just doesn't seem to be the right way of being able to finance these people, because you just throw money at it and you'll get money back. But it's understanding that if you throw money at it and you've got a landing page which is poor and doesn't perform well, then you've lost that money. And the cost of actually acquiring that one customer is the 100 people of the keywords that we put into that. So I think there's a lot of benefit to get marketers on board at a very early age to think, yeah, I can actually prove my gut feeling and test the fact that this is going to work. And hopefully those further up the chain will bring it on board.
And there is something crazy, like marketing will invariably be the highest P&L in a company because the amount spent advertising, getting new customers, etc. And there's something crazy about the fact that it's not the primary place for experimentation, when actually it's the place where you want to prove out that money most. Yeah. Because you're spending most money there, and there's probably the greatest gains to be had there.
One thing that I've thought about with you setting this up in the north is, do you think there is a north-south divide when it comes to experimentation?
Not specifically, no. I think it's a discipline and it's a science, and you can't really argue with the science, and demographics probably don't affect the science. I think in terms of maturity, perhaps we are less immature in the north, and that's speaking off the back of one event.
Did you mean less immature or less mature?
Sorry, less mature in the north. And that's coming off the back of one event, and I certainly wouldn't sit here and say that experimentation is not mature in the north, because that's an ideal way for me to lose attendees, right? Yeah. But I think when you look at, like I say, Holland, massive for experimentation for such a small country, and some of the names in the industry that come out of Holland, there's a real maturity there. And I think it's inevitable that London, as a centre of business, so many people, has a lot of companies that are doing this, and that's why it probably feels more mature. But that's part of the thing I want to break down with this, that I'm not convinced it is any different. It's just that there are more people and more opportunities, and I'm hoping 6 months in, people will see from Experimentation North, well, actually, there are really big companies doing this. They're doing it really well. There's lots of opportunities there. Because I think there's going to be a shift up north, like, businesses, I think, are realising that things are cheaper in the north.
Yeah.
Ironically, one of the sponsors that was kind enough to support us with some money said to me, "Is that all you want? Things really are cheap up north." And I think businesses realise that.
I didn't mean that. I meant double that amount.
Yeah, exactly. And I think businesses realise that, so they move their operations up to places like Manchester and Leeds, which is fantastic. But that's why you want things like this up here, so that they're not losing out on that by not being in London. So I don't think there's an inherent difference, but it's going to be interesting to see how that maturity comes out.
So you say that you run this event, was it every 2 weeks?
Every month. So it's every
month.
second Wednesday of the month. Yeah.
Every second Wednesday of the month. And you do it at both Manchester and Leeds. Are the topics the same in Manchester that they are in Leeds, or do you mix them all around?
They're not. And that's for two reasons. So first of all, we don't specifically focus on any specific topics. What we've done is we've opened up to some fantastic speakers who are really good at this. They've spoken at other events, and we let the speakers dictate what they want to talk about. And the reason for that is we want it to be broad enough that everyone can get something from it. I realise that if we do a session which is just marketing, you might put off the product people, or just statistics, you might put off the marketeers. So I'd like it to be as broad as possible. Although it's unlikely that people will go from Manchester to Leeds. I mean, the Transpennine Express is not the most reliable of routes across the north. It's unlikely that people are going to do that, but I want the option there. So I want people in Leeds to be looking at the event we're having in Manchester and go, actually, that sounds really useful for me. I need to travel over for that. So I don't want to just repeat the same things in different places. I want to keep it fresh and make sure it's different every single time.
You've got a programme of events for the next 12 months, which sounds pretty exciting. I think there is an audience waiting to listen to this sort of thing, and obviously you found that already, whether it's in the north or whether it's in the south. I do think that there is a thirst for more knowledge about experimentation. I wish you the best of luck. I think you're going to have a great time. It's going to be logistically challenging, I know that, because running physical events has always been more challenging than doing a Zoom meeting or whatever it might be, or a webinar, which is that. But I'd like to touch base with you in about 6 months to see how things are progressing and see if your audience is growing, whether you're diversifying that audience and things like that. But for now, Mark, that's fantastic. Really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you so much for your time, John. Really appreciate it.